time once again for Community Forum, and we are very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Jim Waddell. Jim Waddell is a retired civil engineer with 35 years of public service with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and a member of Dam Sense. His work with the National Science Foundation and then as the senior policy analyst for the environment in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy was largely focused on climate change policy, budgets, and research integration. In 1999, he became the deputy district engineer for programs at the Walla Walla district. At the time, the Lower Snake feasibility study was into its fifth year of development. This $33 million study was the most comprehensive ever undertaken by any government to determine the feasibility of breaching dams to restore salmon runs. His recommendations to breach the dams based on the study and input from over 200,000 commenters who were largely in favor of breaching was ignored. And he is here today to talk about the feasibility of breaching the 4 Lower Snake River dams. Jim, thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
It's my pleasure being here.
I really appreciate you coming all that distance. So start out, we just mentioned that you had recommended breaching the dams back when you were working for the Army Corps of Engineers. Can you talk about the reaction when you made that recommendation?
Well, sure. It was, given the nature and culture of the Corps of Engineers, no one has ever talked about breaching a dam until we were doing it then. But to actually recommend that we breach them went over like a lead balloon, frankly. And so once I said that to the commander, and he was sort of a fury writing all this stuff down. It didn't take long though for the reality of the situation to sink in. That it was. It's like I became radioactive at that point. It's like, gee, I don't know if we can talk to this guy anymore. He just recommended we breach dams. So anyway, it was even difficult for me to understand what the process was from there on. We know that my recommendation went to a commander and it went to the next guy up the chain in the division headquarters. But obviously the decision was not, carried forward. And so it was just, kind of forgotten about, frankly. And then I was basically, said, okay, we're done. No more discussion about the dams. We've made the decision. And so, when you're in a military organization, even a civilian, you kind of say, okay, fine. That's a decision. We go with it. And so at that point, I didn't debate it any longer. And it was just one more of those decisions you make in your career and you move on. And that's what I did for the next 8 years of my career.
But you had numbers backing you up. Then, you were basing it on a fairly extensive study.
Yes, we did. When I got to Walla Walla District, I was looking at the final draft of the study at that point, or near final, and I started noticing anomalies, particularly in the economics and so forth, that I didn't understand, and I would ask questions and get lame answers or be told, well, the consultant that did that work is not under contract anymore, so we'd have to open up a new contract. So you got all this government pushback about why we can't change anything. Also, there was a great hesitancy to go back and reopen assumptions that were made because the assumptions had a lot to do with the outcome, economics-wise. And so, it's like, no, it's too late. We can't spend any more time on this. We've already spent $33 million. Yes, that's a lot of money, but we don't have a complete document here. So that's what caused me to say, well, the economics has got lots of questions, and it was evident in the report. And anybody that in fact, you can read these reports today, and if you go to these things, you will see the same thing I saw, is there's some real puzzles in there that just aren't explainable and make it look like, well, what are we trying to cover up here? The biology was pretty clear. The biology said we need to breach these dams, that is the best way to recover salmon. Sure, there was some other gimmicks that could be tried, and that's what we did. There were 2 alternatives to, hang additional infrastructure on the dams to the tune of $30 million. But, those were seen as, we think that will work, but the best bet is dam breaching. But so anyway, that's the kind of the way it shook out at the time and why I recommended we breach the dams.
All right, so fast forward then to you basically were put in limbo there for 8 years, and then a few years back, you kind of had a public outing at a public forum. Can you talk about that?
Sure. And I really wasn't put in limbo. I moved on to a South Atlantic division in Atlanta where they wanted me to come there and run military construction programs. So I did that for 6 years. Then I retired and moved to Port Angeles, Washington. And actually, I was reappointed 3 times by the Corps of Engineers to do some special work for the Environmental Protection Agency that they were interested in me having to continue with. And so I was actually in Port Angeles in this reappointment part-time employment with the Corps, but I was also trying to become a retired person and just kind of do those things, like take my mind off of things and go out and do volunteer like beach cleanups and, go and help people count salmon, smolts and stuff like that. Just, kind of get my hands into things as opposed to thinking about things. But at that time, in 2011, the Elwha dams were being breached, and there was a science symposium going on. So I thought I'd go to it and learn what I could about the Elwha since I didn't know anything about it, and I only lived a mile away. So I'm sitting there in this big symposium with about 800 or 900 people, and there's 2 speakers up there talking about the Snake River dams. And I thought that was odd since we're sitting here in Elwha country. But anyway, they were just drawing the analogy between breaching the Elwha and the Snake, and they both gave very, very compelling and good stories of why, for the sake of the salmon, you need to breach these dams. But they also ended up saying, but this is a lot tougher than Elwha because these dams provide a lot of economic benefit, and while it's questionable, it'll take a long time, 15 to 20 years, before we ever get around to resolving, these economic issues and overcoming those concerns. I knew that was wrong, and I just couldn't sit there any longer. And so I walked around to the front of this big hall, and wondered how I was going to intervene on this situation. And fortunately, the moderator said, "We got time for one question." And so I just jumped up to the mic and said, "I don't have a question, but I got a statement to make." And that's when I said, I told them who I was, and everybody dropped their jaws when I told them I was from the Army Corps of Engineers. I also told them I'd probably get fired for what I was about to say because I was still under this reappointment authority. And so I told them these dams can easily be breached. The economics is not there. They're a travesty. They're a waste of taxpayer money, those 4 dams in eastern Washington, and we need that money elsewhere and to put on other dams and stuff like that. And I kind of criticized the public, too. I said, you're not paying attention to these documents. If you'd read this stuff, you would have seen that these dams were an economic problem and needed to be dealt with. So that's how I got back into this. And then what I didn't realize is I was being filmed by a film crew from Patagonia. And they were, afterward, they came up to me and said, "Hey, we'd like to put you in this documentary we're making." I went, "Oh, sure, fine, right, okay." And then they said, "We want to come and interview you." So they did about, 6 months later. And for 3 hours, we went through all the background on this thing. And I didn't really take it serious. But then about a year later, they said, "Well, I started getting, emails about, hey, the thing's going to come out soon. You're in it." And the movie was Damnation, by the way. Some of you have probably seen that. And they said, "We want you to come and do panels with us." And so that's when I realized I better do my homework on this. And because I don't want to be, caught asked questions about, well, why did you recommend breaching the dam? What was your concern? So I went back and started reviewing these reports all over again about 3 years ago. And I thought I would find errors like $10 million here, $15 million there. But after I really got into this thing with retirement time on my hands, it didn't take long for me to realize that the errors were in the $100 million range here and there, 50 here, 100 there. For instance, the price of breaching the dams was not 8 or 900 million. It was more like 350 million. And so those are gross, massive errors. And so when I looked at when you added up all these errors, what I realized is it totally changed the economic argument for why we should keep the dams. So instead of saying that there's a benefit of a few $1 million in keeping the dam and the cost would be $250 million a year, it was the other way around. It was actually something close to $100 million benefit if you breach the dams. So that works out to a $350 million error that was embedded in that economics analysis. So that's what got me back into the game. And then I started, actually made a trip to D.C. and met with senior staff with the Corps of Engineers and pointed this out and so forth. And after, given my background in Walla Walla and as an engineer and worked on this stuff, they didn't question too much what I was saying. And so the conversation sort of shifted, well, how do we move the ball down the court? I mean, what do we do about the dams? And so then I all of a sudden I ended up in the role of not only correcting numbers, but figuring out what is the policies that will allow you to breach these dams. And that's caused me to go back and do some more research and rely on my experience in the Corps. That basically what I realized is the assumption that we'd been making that Congress needed to deauthorize or authorize the breaching of the dams was not correct. And actually I said that in the movie, and that's wrong. But in the meantime, what I realized, and I've known this for years, is the Corps because Congress has given the Corps a fiduciary responsibility to ensure that all their existing projects are economically viable. So if they're investing more money, they still have to have a positive return on investment. And if they have to be good for the environment, or let's put it this way, they can't harm the environment. And they have to be technically sufficient. In other words, they're not in danger of something. Well, in this case, we had an economic problem with the dams, and we had clearly an environmental problem. We were harming salmon in a big way. And so, that led to the, look at this thing and saying, okay, the Corps does have the responsibility to act on this at that point. The next big problem, though, of course, is how do you pay for this? You're going to breach a dam, and even though the price is a lot less, the dams are actually quite easy to breach because each of the dams has an earthen berm to it. A portion of the dam is earthen, and it's easy to remove that with a couple of bulldozers, and then you hydraulically breach the rest of it, the last 30 or 40 feet of it. So it's really simple to do and inexpensive, but still, even if it's only, in the case of the first dam, it's about $40 or $50 million. Where does that money come from? Who writes that check? And so that's always a big issue for the Corps. Well, what people don't realize is that Bonneville Power Administration is actually responsible for about 92% of the cost, a minimum of 92% of the cost of those dams. And that's laid out in the plan formulation and allocation procedures of those dams. So that means that Bonneville Power is supposed to write that check. Bonneville's money doesn't come from Congress. It comes from you ratepayers out there. Now, so there's a mechanism, though, where Bonneville can actually take a credit by calling that fish mitigation, which indeed it is, because that's the best fish mitigation you can possibly imagine, is to return those reservoirs to a free-flowing river. And so what I found is there is a way to pay for this without going to Congress. And the Corps has a fiduciary responsibility anyway to take care of problems like that. So that's kind of how I got to the point of where I am now, of telling people that they need to be breached. Here's the economics, and we can talk more about that in a minute. Or here's the policy that allows you to do it.
All right, and just to clarify, we're talking about just the 4 lower Snake River dams. You're not proposing breaching of other dams either in Washington or nationwide?
That's correct, Mike. This analysis, my work, everything that I'm familiar with, I'm totally focused on the lower Snake dams. And what I'll say, though, is that the point is that infrastructure is in short money. So any money that we can free up from the Snake River dams, because we're spending close to $150 million on those 4 dams today, a combination of Corps money and Bonneville Power money. And that money could be better spent on dams on the Columbia, on the main stem Columbia, where those dams are, produce a lot more hydropower.
So we're actually losing, financially, we're losing money on these.
That's correct. They're losers. From a real standpoint, every year that you're spending money, we're not getting, you could spend it somewhere else. But when you put it into the economic context, and what that means is you say, well, what is, over the life of these projects, and that's the way the Corps has to look at these things, what is your return on investment? And so what I did to do that is we looked at all the cost of the dams, and then we had a couple of groups that were economic consultants to look at both the hydropower work and the overall economic situation of the dams. And I'll start with the hydropower piece. Looking at Bonneville Power reports, it looked like to me there was some indication that we had surplus power in the region. So we had an economist look at this, and he did a report, and basically what he came to the conclusion was, yes, there's basically an 18% surplus of power in the Pacific Northwest. The Snake River dams, their actual production is only around less than 3% of that. And so you could shut those dams down and know the lights aren't going to go in Seattle if you do that, or they're not going to go off. And so all you do is you give up 2 or 3% of a surplus. And what's interesting here is the Northwest Power Planning Council their recent 6th power plan about 2 months ago came out, and buried down in the 100 pages of documents there, they concluded that you could take out all the coal plants in the Pacific Northwest, breach the 4 snake dams, and you'd still have plenty of power. You still have a surplus. And so, so what's the problem here? They also stated that any future demand in the Pacific Northwest for the next 20 years can be handled through conservation. And conservation is basically just putting, better windows on your house and using LED light bulbs. Now, we went one step further, though, because the Corps says, okay, we're making $200 million a year off those dams right now from hydropower, and we should replace that power. So we calculated what is the replacement power cost, and actually the economist said it works out that you can use solar in eastern Washington for half the power. And if you think about it, solar in eastern Washington is perfect because in the summertime when you really need that peaking power is when you've got incredible sunlight over there. And so pricing it out with solar and half open market, which means a lot of wind energy, you're able to replace that power. And here's the key thing, even with that replacement power, you don't necessarily need it, but if you did, when you calculate the total benefit to cost ratio on these 4 dams, it works out to 15 cents on the dollar. That's what the taxpayers are getting. You invest $1, you get 15 cents back. I don't think I need to tell you that's not a very good idea. So that's the second part of the analysis, was adding up all those different costs for recreation and hydropower and so forth. And by the way, people keep thinking these are flood control dams. They are not. They're not flood control dams. And so that's not an issue. But that's, the downside is that we're losing 85 cents on the dollar. Here's the upside if you breach. We're talking somewhere between $4 and $20 of return on investment. And the reason there's a range there is because it goes back to hydropower. Do we need to replace it? If not, it's 20 to 1. And here's what we're losing out here is in eastern Washington, in 6 counties along that river, they're foregoing about 3,000 to 4,000 jobs a year in the recreation industry by not having a free-flowing river. That equates to about $500 million in direct expenditures every year that the people of Washington are missing out on. So, it's really, that is part of the economic analysis that we've got numbers on that the Corps did initially, we've corrected. But there's more to it. When you free up 140 miles of this lower Snake River, you open up 40,000 acres of land. 20,000 of that acres is underwater right now. That land used to be agricultural land. And so if you take just 4,000 or 5,000 of those acres out of 40,000 and replant vineyards and orchards and stuff like that used to be there before the dams were put in place, you actually are creating a pretty powerful economic engine through this high-end agriculture. And of course, when you talk viticultures and orchards, you're talking, wineries and all this kind of stuff, and the restaurants and inns and all that stuff that goes with that. That is an incredible economic benefit that's never been calculated. And then what's cool for the state of Washington is that lands will be transferred to the state of Washington, and that then any revenue from those lands goes into the state school budget. And so we know the state school budget's a problem in this state. Well, here we got a bill payer, maybe $20, $30 million a year minimum, that could go into the budget just by doing that.
So talk about the environmental benefits. One of the big losers, the biggest loser actually is our salmon. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, our fishery agencies in the region here tell us that we have lots of, we're times of abundance, we've got record runs and all this kind of stuff. Well, that's because they compare it to maybe 20 years ago when we had very bad ocean conditions and salmon were in trouble along with, because of the dams and everything else. But frankly, when you look at it in the historical perspective, between 10 and 20 million salmon made it up to the lower Snake River. And so these numbers that we're looking at today, 300, 400, 500,000 at the tops of salmon, is a fraction of that. So no, we don't have this abundance that people talk about. The records are because we use shifting baselines. And the other thing about these salmon is people have to understand is about 85% of them are hatchery salmon. And here is the real urgency, is that these hatchery salmon are depleting the genetics of the wild salmon. And so we're down to just a handful, 10 or 15% of the salmon left are actually truly wild. And that genetics depletes every year. And our own government documents and individuals that are really experiencing this are telling us we've only got a couple of years left before we lose the last wild genetics. Once that happens, hatchery salmon will too follow, depletion. They can't sustain themselves with this poor genetics. And so it won't be long before hatchery salmon, start falling off too. And that's already happening. We can see it in the numbers this year. So this whole idea about abundance is kind of a myth. And the fact is, this is the urgency. This is why we say these dams have got to be, the breaching has got to start this year in 2016, because we're running out of time. And, we hear about, that we just had a judge's decision that says, hey, the government's plans for the fifth time have been, if the judge said they're no good, you got to start over. Well, that's great that he pointed out that, it validates what we've been saying, you need to breach the dams. But on the other hand, for him and the government to say, he's the judge, he said, let's spend a couple of years, give me a new plan. But on the other hand, the government doesn't have to do that. They can breach these dams today. But what they want to do, and there's a lot of groups behind them, including a lot of the environmental groups, that say, well, yeah, we want a fresh start. We want to relook at this thing. We want new numbers. And what people forget, we've been at this for over 20 years. And it's kind of like, imagine that, you're a patient in a hospital and, you've got 4 bullets in your chest and you're bleeding to death. And yet, instead of, having surgeons remove those bullets, you've got a bunch of technicians and folks that say, well, let's study this. Let's see if we can come up with some alternate technologies. Let's see, why don't we just, use a lot of blood transfusions and try some fancy things that might dissolve bullets in the chest or something. And so you spend 20 or 30 years in the recovery room and you're still there. And so that's where we are. We can't start over. We can't bring in a new team of doctors. And yeah, they're making plenty of money off, these doctors are making plenty of money off this 20 or 30 year experiment. But if you're that patient, you're still in the recovery room, you want to fix. And the fix is take the bullets out. In this case, it's take the 4 dams out of the river and let the salmon get back. And that's how you recover them. But we're almost out of time to do that.
And even the hatchery operations we have are very expensive and completely inadequate.
Well, I will only speak to the hatcheries that on the lower Snake River that were put there to mitigate for the loss of salmon. They are not doing very well. In fact, I mean, the genetics of those salmon are very poor, and they actually are depleting the ability of the wild salmon to maintain their genes. They also compete with the food. And so when you've got these warm reservoirs and so forth, and hatchery salmon, competing for food and stuff like that, it just makes it more difficult for the wild salmon. And hatcheries are very expensive, and that's one of the biggest cost increases I've discovered, is that they're incredibly expensive to maintain and replace. And yet that seems to be the preferred method, is to keep pumping more salmon or more blood into this patient instead of taking the bullets out of the chest.
I know you studied climate impacts previously as part of your profession, and don't the dams themselves create, the reservoirs create warm zones that are actually damaging to the fish?
Well, absolutely. In a reservoir compared to a free-flowing river will absorb a lot more heat. And that's been going on since they first put the reservoirs in. And so there's always been a temperature issue. And what the temperature does, salmon need very cold water to survive. And so when it warms up, then it kills the juveniles and the adults as well, or inhibits their ability to migrate. And it also increases predation because the predators like the warmer water, so they eat the salmon. With climate change, it's just getting worse. Last year, we lost nearly the entire Idaho sockeye run. We're in that same situation this year. And that's why we're saying you need to begin drawing down that top reservoir in the next month or two in order to get that reservoir out of the way so we can get cooler water into the river. And that cooler water goes all the way down to Columbia, too, so it cools off the whole system. So, yes, that's a big problem.
And we don't want to neglect mentioning another key species here in our area, which is the southern pods of orca whales that are like apparently literally starving from lack of salmon.
That's true. We have a resident population in Puget Sound that depends on Chinook salmon. A large part of those Chinook come from the Snake River, and these orcas are, yes, they're starving, according to the orca biologist. And most people don't realize that. There are other orcas that eat seals and other stuff, but these particular orcas only eat Chinook, so they're at risk too, and they're on the endangered species list. And so we're going to lose those too. And I think this all points to the urgency that we've been trying to express to the government leaders in Washington, D.C., and to the two senators in the state and the governor with some, not with a lot of success here locally, because regionally everybody's so bought into these dams, they just can't imagine that there's any alternative. And yet we've shown that that is not the case. There's a much better alternative. But trying to find the way to influence these people and get the message to them has been a task. And I remind people when we talk about this, and you listeners out there, is that, who do you know? Who do you know that can talk to the White House or the president or the Governor Inslee or Senator Murray or something and get the message to them, allow them to have a discussion about this? For instance, we know that Paul Allen is very interested in the Snake River dams. And in fact, may have, he has people working on plans to deal with this. But I don't think Mr. Allen actually knows what I have just explained to you people. He knows some of it from the salmon, but he doesn't. I don't know that he's been given the economic story. I don't know that he's been given the urgency that we're dealing with. And so somebody can be a real hero here. Whoever really initiates and gets something going with the government here is going to be the hero. And this may be a chance for him, if he's interested in this, is to do something now. Call a president or work with the governor or something like that to convince them that the federal agencies created this mess, and it's up to them to solve it, and they certainly can, but they're going to need some nudging, because you understand, this is all political, and it's going to take that kind of leverage. So, somebody like Paul Allen could actually if he engages now, as opposed to waiting 5 or 6 years to get involved in more studies, because we can't do more studies. We don't need to do any more studies. We got all the data we need. And, the numbers are there. And so it's a matter of just, pulling the trigger on this and getting those, in this case, getting those 4 bullets out of the chest.
We're talking with Jim Waddell. He is with DamSense and a retired civil engineer with 35 years of public service with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. How can people find out more about this issue and get those important numbers to pass on to others?
Well, the simplest way is we have a website, and it's DamSense is not really an organization. It's just a website, and it's dam as DAMSENSE.org. And you can go there, and you can see all the letters of record and reports, and the economic work is all sitting there. There's ways that we have phone numbers and so forth where you can contact. We do a phone drill on the White House every Friday. And so if you dial 202-456-111, you can call a White House operator and you tell Obama to breach the lower Snake dams now while he's president. And that's key. He's got to do this while he's the president. We can't start this process all over again. And if he doesn't do it, it's not going to happen, folks. Not for a long time. And it's over for the salmon and probably in the orcas as well.
Which means we're not far behind, if that is true. All right. Well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming and spending time with us this morning.
Well, thanks, Mike. I really appreciate you inviting me.